I recently made a video about Jerry Coyne, life science professor at the University of Chicago, and his belief in determinism and why his argument is so bad. And I talked about how weird it is that such a smart guy could make such a bad argument. His argument was logically invalid. It was fallacious. It didn't work. Now, Coyne, as a determinist, is also an evolutionist, and he's much better known for his evolution belief. He talks about it, he writes about it, and here's a book that he wrote, Why Evolution is True, well-known book, and in this book he makes a lot of arguments. Just like he argues for determinism, he makes a lot of arguments for evolution. Now, a difference is these arguments for evolution that Coyne makes are not fallacious, they're not invalid, they are perfectly valid. And what that means when we say valid is that the conclusion is a necessary consequence of the premise. You give me the premise, and it's just a series of logical steps, and if the premise is true, then the conclusion must be true. It's a necessary consequence of the premise. That's a logically valid argument. And Cohen's arguments are perfectly logical, airtight, and they're also compelling. These are strong arguments that Coyne is making. So it is valid. What's going on then? Well, there's another criteria to judge an argument by. You have the question of whether it's logical, whether it's valid. The other criteria is it sound? What that means is the premise true? I said that a valid argument is such that the conclusion is a necessary consequence of the premise. If the premise is true, the conclusion is true. But then your question becomes, is the premise true? And so that's, if it's a false premise, it's an unsound argument. If it's a true premise, it's a sound argument. That's the other criteria to judge an argument by. And you're probably thinking now, okay, he's going to say that Cohen's argument for evolution, although valid, is not sound. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say Cohen's arguments are unsound. But I am going to attach a little tiny caveat, and you need to understand this caveat. This is the key, this little hinge that is so crucial. If you don't understand this, you won't understand evolution, and you will not understand today's world because evolution is so influential. So what's going on here? I'm going to give you an example argument from Cohen's book here on page 81. He talks about the argument from bad design, and that's his phrase, bad design. And here's what he says. What I mean by bad design is the notion that if organisms were built from scratch by a designer, one who used the biological building blocks of nerves, muscles, bone, and so on, they would not have such imperfections. The species would not have such imperfections. And he gives an example there on page 81 and 82 of flatfish. These flatfish are born symmetrical. They've got an eye on each side, but after about a month, one of the eyes migrates around to the other side. And so you have an asymmetrical body plan. Last time we talked about bilaterians, and bilaterians have left-right symmetry. So these fish do not have left-right symmetry. After the eye migrates over, you've got two eyes on the one side. Very, very interesting. And so Coyne uses these flatfish examples as examples of bad design. Now, we can argue whether or not that actually is bad design. I'll come back to that in a second, but let's just take that as a given. This is bad design. So here's the argument, very simple. Summarize it. Step one, if a designer created the world, it would be perfect. Species would not have any bad designs. Step two, we observe bad designs. Step three, therefore, a designer must not have created this world. And so what are you left with? Somehow, some way, you have evolution. Evolution must have done it. Where I'm defining evolution broadly as simply the species arose by natural laws, natural processes, somehow. And that's the argument from bad design. It's airtight, logically airtight. But the premise is the question then, is it true that if a designer created the species, they would not have any imperfections? Now, I'm not going to say that this is unsound, as I mentioned, but the reason I'm not going to say it's unsound is because there's no science behind it, let me ask you this question. How would you show that this premise is true? What scientific experiment could you do, could you perform to learn this tidbit of knowledge? How could you know that if a designer were to have created the world, it would be perfect? Answer, of course, is there is no scientific experiment. There is no way to learn this from science. And that's why I'm not going to say it's not true. I'm not going to say it's unsound, because it isn't something that I can know from science anyway. This is a religious belief. It is a metaphysical belief above the science, before the science. It doesn't come from science. And so Coyne is making a religious argument. In fact, there's a long history here of Coyne did not make this up. I'm not going to get into this history, but for centuries, religious people, Christians, have been making arguments about to this effect. A good God, a smart God, a designer would not create these imperfections. So Coyne is really relying on a long history here, which influenced Darwin, and Darwin's book had a lot of these arguments too. So you've got a religious argument going on here. Coyne, of course, never defends this, never acknowledges that he's making a religious argument. He is oblivious to his reliance on a religious premise. He asserts it. I just read you the quote. He doesn't follow that with, and now I'm going to explain to you why this is true. It doesn't have that. He sets that forth as though it's self-evident. It's just a given. He asserts it. It's a bare assertion. And this reminds me of something that Alfred North Whitehead once wrote. He said, when you're criticizing someone's argument or someone's belief, don't go to the thing that he is defending, the thing that he is saying. Don't attack him on what he is saying. Rather, criticize him on what he's not saying, on what he is taking for granted, which he sees no reason to defend. He is oblivious to. And it was such a cogent comment by Whitehead. It absolutely applies for evolution. This is typical. This isn't just Jerry Coyne. Evolutionists make these kinds of arguments consistently, do not defend their premise, their religious premise. The argument is a religious argument. If you have a premise that is required to make the argument, and the premise contains a religious belief, then your argument is religious. The whole structure, the whole project, the whole program is religious. Coyne is making a religious argument for a religious theory. That's why I say religion drives science in ways that are not acknowledged. That's the interesting part. So you've got this weird thing where a smart guy is making this argument that he's certain of. He says it's true, and he's basing it on a religious argument that he does not acknowledge. So again, we have a weird situation. It's not that it's invalid, as with his determinism argument. It's that it's religious. And on top of that, he does not acknowledge that it's religious. In fact, let's add another layer of icing on the cake. Coyne is an atheist. As an atheist, he believes in matter and energy, the material world. There's no immaterial world. There's no metaphysical truths. There's no religious truths. There's no basis to make any sort of metaphysical claims about anything. So Coyne is making a religious claim. His argument, his conclusions are hinging on this. He requires a religious claim, and he has no basis for it. He can say nothing about the immaterial world. He doesn't believe it exists. He has no basis for judging whether a designer would do X, Y, or Z, or anything else. He has no metaphysical truths possible to him. All he has is the atoms and molecules in his head. So there's this massive internal contradiction in his system. Not only is he making a religious claim, not only is he oblivious or not acknowledging his debt to religion, but he has an internal contradiction where he cannot even make that assertion in the first place according to his own claims of what he believes. Is he really an atheist, or is he not? Is he a closet theist and he doesn't. He's in denial of his own theism. That's a psychological question. We can argue that all day long. I don't really care what his state is. He's a confused man, a terribly confused man, and with a massive internal contradiction, and he's oblivious to his own debt to religion. So religion drives science, and it matters.